until I'm enlightened, to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened, to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened, to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. For those who are following along in the text, we're on near the bottom of page 254 in Lama Tsongkhapa's text, Lama text. And just to kind of remind people, so we're in the section, of course, on emptiness, special insight, which I guess is the way he is on emptiness, but it's often referred to as the section on Maktong, or special insight, Vipassana. And so Lama Tsongkhapa just went, in the section we just finished, right? Lama Tsongkhapa went into great detail about how, first of all, obviously he's presenting emptiness from the Prasangika Majjhamaka perspective. And then he went into detail about how our not having the wisdom understanding emptiness, in other words, our ignorance, grasping at true existence or inherent existence. And he went through this whole quite deep explanation about how that gives rise to samsara. Right? And how first, and actually he went through quite a bit of detail. I'll just remind you guys, right? So because he was talking about how first the aggregates appear as though they were inherently existent. And we grasp at that appearance is true. Then, based on that appearance, right, he was saying, because first first phenomena, right, meaning the aggregates appear as truly existent. Then, based on that, the person has the appearance of the appearance arises of the person as truly existent or inherently existent, and then we grasp at that appearance. And then once that arises, right, then he goes into detail about all the other, what they call in this translation, they were calling it elaborations. Right? So elaborations of, pleasant and unpleasant, good and bad, and so on. That they all arise based on that grasping at oneself as truly a person, meaning oneself as truly existing. And then based on those further elaborations, one gives rise to attachment, grasping, desire, and hatred, aversion, anger, and so on. And then from that, all the different mental afflictions arise. Then based on those mental afflictions, we do actions, right, karma. And based on that, the entire cycle of suffering, rebirth arises. And so he went through that in great detail, right? Pointing out that one has to contemplate that over and over again and connect it to one's own experience and see if it's true, right? As we were talking about. Because he was saying if you just have some vague notion of that, then you won't really, then even if you sort of hear about emptiness, it won't have much effect, will it? Because you'll look for your, actually, and we do, right? Whereas even if intellectually you say, oh, I'm Buddhist, I'm a follower of from a Majjhamaka perspective, whatever, in your heart you won't actually practice that. In your heart you'll look for freedom from suffering and happiness some other way. And your meditation on emptiness will be kind of not very, you won't actually have that strong an interest in it, will you? Because actually, he's pointing out very simply, right? What we put our energy into and enthusiasm into is what we believe will make us happy and not suffer. Right? And so if we understand how the wisdom understanding emptiness is what will grant us freedom from suffering, is what will grant us happiness and well-being, then there will be a great kind of enthusiasm. Right? And anyway, and interest in that topic. So anyway, he went through all that, right? And so then the point being that if you can, and he made this very clear point, because we're going to get into this now today, but last time he made this point, he said, Tsongkhapa was pointing out, right? Emptiness is not just that appearance of the appearance and the grasping of the self as truly existent or inherently existent. He made this very clear point. He said, just distracting yourself from that is not an antidote to that, right? And he made that point. He said there are three ways things can appear, right? As though they were, as true, three ways we relate to phenomena or sort of see phenomena. One is as if they were inherently existent. Another is the exact opposite of that, right? The realizing that they're not inherently existent. And the third is kind of a mind that that doesn't do either, is the way he put it. And so a mind that doesn't do either is not an antidote. That's not a wisdom understanding. Emptiness and it won't harm ignorance. Right? So we have to directly refute that mind. We have to refute both the appearance. Actually, we have to cut off both the false appearance of true existence and the mind grasping at that. Right? So he's going to get into now how do you do that. Right? But if you don't, he made this point last time, so I'll just remind you because this is what otherwise it won't make sense where we're going next. Right? That he made this point. You have to directly refute, so you have to identify the object of negation, right? Meaning that false appearance of inherent existence, and then you have to directly refute that in order to realize emptiness. Okay. So then I'll just pick up where we left off, at the bottom of page 254. And here he's, so we're in the section on settling or realizing or settling in the sense of analyzing and coming to a conclusion about the selflessness of persons. And so, and actually, maybe I'll make more comment as we go into this section, right? Because part of what's going on in this next bit of the text is, so first of all, we're going to have to learn from, in this, and he's going to go through this, Lama Tsongkhapa will go through it, how do you refute, how do you give rise, how do you recognize the object of negation in your own experience, right? Internally, it can't be just intellectual. I mean, first you have to understand it intellectually, but then you have to find that object of negation in your own experience. Your sense of an inherently existent I. And he goes through in some detail about this, right? Because there is identifying that there are many different objects of negation. For example, there's an object of negation that's a permanent self, right? But that's not the subtle one. And then all the different tenet systems of Buddhism present objects of negation at different levels of subtlety. And here he's talking about the most subtle one, right? The one that presented by the Chandrakirti and the Prasangika and the Nagarjuna and the Prasangika perspective. And then you're going to have to refute that, right? But one more point I just want to make, because it's just giving context again, is that one thing that Lama Tsongkhapa is placing great emphasis on here is that, so we have to recognize that object of negation, we have to prove to ourselves that it doesn't exist at all, right? And at the same time, we have to be able to understand how things do exist as mere dependent arisings. Right? And they often say, Lama Tsongkhapa himself says in this text, this is right in the middle length Lamrim, also in the great treatise on the stages of the path, Lamrim Chenmo. He makes a point, he says, it's very difficult. Right? He says that's the most difficult part, is how do you refute inherent existence while at the same time understanding that everything functions. That things function as dependent arisings, and that that dependent arising is. He said, I mean, Lama Tsongkhapa and actually Chandrakirti say it's a synonym for emptiness. Right? So dependent arising means emptiness. Emptiness means dependent arising, and to be able to make a harmony between those two. And if you look at all the other Buddhist tenet systems, from a Prasangika perspective, they can't do that. Right? Any other philosophical position has to apply some kind of inherent existence in order to understand how dependent arising works. So it's a very unique position. So that's what we're going to explore. Is how do you find a harmony, or there is, yeah, a harmony, we could say, between those two, dependent origination and emptiness. So here, Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, he's in this section where he's talking about, he's been talking about, he had talked about what the identification of what is a person, right? And so he went through, it could be a being of the six realms, that was just above, and then, and now he's talking about, so the person that does exist, right, that's because that's what we just said, right? How, there's the object of negation, the inherently existent person does not exist, right? But there is a person that exists. How does it exist? As merely labeled on the aggregates, right? So here he's saying, he's describing the sutra passage we covered last time. He says, the sutra passage is saying that the collection of the aggregates is the basis of imputation of the person. And the basis of imputation is not admissible as the imputed phenomena. Right, so what he's getting at there is the, right, it's quite subtle, isn't it? That the aggregates, right, the five aggregates, or we could say the body and mind, are the basis of imputation of the person. Right? So they're the basis on which we label. Right? Now he's making a point. He's saying, so that which it's, the basis of imputation of the person is not the person. That's a subtle distinction, isn't it? So he's saying here, the basis of imputation is not admissible as the imputed phenomena. The imputed phenomena in this case is the person, right? So he's saying, on the basis of the aggregates, we impute the person, so the aggregates aren't the person. The collection of the aggregates must be understood as both the collection of the aggregates at a given moment and the collection of aggregates over earlier and later ones. Therefore, it is inadmissible to posit the continuum of the collection of the aggregates as the person. Right? So what he's making this kind of very, it's actually a subtle distinction, but it's a very important distinction, isn't it? So, first of all, here he said, he's talking about a collection, right? Remember earlier we were talking about the perishable collection, right? So the five aggregates are a perishable, or a collection that's always changing, right? And so he's making 2 points here. He's saying, in what sense are the aggregates a collection? And he's saying, well, we can talk about that in 2 different ways, and they're both reasonable. One is they're a collection in the sense there are 5 of them, right? Form, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, consciousness. So in that sense, there are 5, so it's a collection of things. Right? Then he makes another point. He says, also, there's a collection of aggregates over earlier and later ones. Right? So he's saying, like, there's yesterday's aggregates and today's aggregates, and 2 days ago's aggregates. And so there's a temporal collection. Does that make sense? You could say that. A collection of, because today's aggregates are not identical to yesterday's aggregates. So in that sense, there's also a temporal collection, which I'm using today and yesterday, but Lama Tsongkhapa does point out at times. That temporal collection can also be moment to moment. Right? I mean, it's easier to recognize when we say last year's aggregate. If I say, are my last year's aggregates identical to this year's aggregate, you can say, well, no, I've gotten older. I can see that. It's harder to see that there's also change moment to moment, right? But if you contemplate it, of course, it becomes quite obvious, doesn't it? Whereas we know our organs are continually, they're never static, right? Even the molecules, the cells of our body and so on, nothing's static. Our mind certainly isn't static, right? If you watch your mind when doing breathing meditation or something, it's jumping all over. And there are moments of consciousness, right? So he's saying you can see a collection in the present moment, or you can see a collection, and you can see a collection temporally, right? And so he's saying, here he's saying, and actually it's an important point he's making here, because some Buddhist schools, actually, all other Buddhist schools, other than the Prasangikas, assert that there's something there, that there's something in the aggregates that is the person. Right? Now here he's giving a uniquely Prasangika, right? Uniquely, what do you say? I also use consequentialist, right? Prasangika, that's the school, if you don't know. So here, right, what's he saying? He's making this uniquely Prasangika point, right? Which is every other Buddhist tenet system, every other Buddhist philosophical position says there is something from the side of the aggregates that's the person, right? Some tenet systems, as he points out, say the collection of the aggregates over time is the person. Others, like the second most subtle school, right? The mind-only school, and also certain Svatantrika Madhyamikas, will say it's the consciousness, right? That's the person. But Lama Tsongkhapa here is saying there is the basis of imputation, right? That on which we label the person isn't the person. And so how does the person exist? As merely labeled on the aggregates, right? So that, where we're saying, because we're in the section, we're going to talk about the emptiness of persons, right? So he's saying, actually, he's already, it's funny. We're going to talk about the emptiness of persons, right? In a sense, if you understand the identification of what is a person, you've already, if you really understand that, you've already understood the emptiness of the person in a way. Isn't that quite funny? Because he's saying, what is the person? The person is that which is merely labeled on the aggregates, right? And so in what sense does a person exist? It's a dependent horizon, right? It depends upon the aggregates, and it depends upon the label, person, right? Me, self, I, whatever. And so that's and so when we're looking at this, that's the person that we're going to be discussing, Paul. Yeah.
And the label is permanent. And so itself, so it can't change from moment to moment, even though it seems like it does.
Say more what you mean. I'm not sure. Like, say your point. You're making a point.
The label would not exist without the basis of imputation, the five aggregates. So the label is a permanent object. So clearly it's non-existent also.
Right. Yeah, no, that's true. And permanent in the sense of not changing moment to moment because it's not
Right.
a product. Yeah.
Right.
Sure, it was changed from moment to moment. That's a bit not.
The label doesn't.
Oh, the label doesn't.
The label does, yeah.
But the label is just our perception, so it does change.
Actually, more important, like in this, in the sense that Paul is using it, like, well, actually, there are different ways to say it. One is, literally, the label's a word. I mean, so it's not our, like, there is what they're saying, what he's saying here is, like, there's, you could say there's a perception of the aggregates, and then there's a word, like your name, let's say, right? Cynthia.
So the aggregates can change over time, and the label can, as they change, or accept different labels could be.
Exactly,
added
yeah.
each time.
Yeah, so like in other words, your name Cynthia isn't changing it instant by instant, is what Paul said. Like there is that's been your name. Now you could change your name, and then the label changes. So it's not permanent in the sense of unchanging eternally, but it's not. He's using in Buddhism when we say impermanent means changing moment to moment, and the permanent in the sense that Paul is using it means not changing moment to moment.
Just static.
So your aggregates are changing instant by instant, but your name isn't changing instant by instant.
But it's relative and subjective because someone else can call me something else.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, it's still relative, it's still subjective, but it's not changing instant by instant, and that's in the way that the body and the mind are. Yeah, you got it, exactly. So now he says, when the collection is posited as the basis of imputation, that which is collected, meaning the aggregates, is also posited as the basis of imputation, and therefore it's unreasonable for both to be the person. And so part of what he's saying here also is he's kind of debating against people who would assert that one is that the aggregates are the person, right? And so he's pointing out here that actually we're going to get more into this in the next page, but what he's saying here is, if somebody were to assert the collection of the aggregates is the person, he would say, well, what he's saying here, right, is, well, there's the collection of the aggregates, and then there's each aggregate, for example, right? So which are you saying is the person? Right? If it's the collection, it can't be the individual, the individual aggregates. If it's the individual aggregates, it can't be the collection. So he's giving another reason why the basis of imputation isn't that which is imputed. Does that make sense? That which the I exists in dependence upon the aggregates, which means that the I is not the aggregates. That which depends on something isn't the thing that depends on something can't be what it depends upon, right? That's part of what he's saying here.
So the collection of aggregates over time, so as the label would change with aggregates, with whatever over time, the collection of aggregates over time, it sounds like, I guess, that is what you're trying to negate. not right, as that identifying as the collection of aggregates over time is I. Because I would totally say, that's me.
So what, your question is that, well, because actually, are you saying that you think we're trying to negate that the aggregates exist over time?
Trying to negate the imputation that the collection of aggregates over time can be labeled as I.
But it can be labeled as that.
Yeah, I thought you were saying it could be.
No, he's saying that's how what he's saying is,
That is the I.
no, actually, oh, you said two different things, that's important.
Okay.
So it's an important distinction that we have to be very precise in it, because it's very subtle, right? Because what he's getting at here is, because you said two different things. You said it could be the basis of imputation of the I, and then you said it's the I.
Imputation of the I, my bad.
And that's different, because in other words, that it can be the basis of imputation of the I is correct. But that it is the I is what he's refuting, right? And one thing he's refuting. He's saying, and there are many faults, which we're about to get into. If you said the collection of the aggregates over time is the I, there are many problems then you would get into. One is like, well, is yesterday's collection Lisa, or is 2 days ago's collection Lisa? Which one's Lisa? If you say it's the basis of imputation, well, Lisa was merely labeled,
In the collection.
and you can even say she was, you could label Lisa on that collection of moments, right?
You can impute Lisa.
You could impute it, yeah.
Right.
But if you say Lisa actually exists,
That's-
that would be a problem, right?
Right.
Because then if you say, well, then you have to be able to point out, well, where's Lisa in that collection?
Right.
And there's all kinds of problems. So the collection of aggregates over time is not, if you say that is Lisa, then that's a problem. If you say that's a basis of imputation of Lisa, and Lisa exists as a mere imputation upon the collection of the aggregates over time, that's fine.
Okay. Cool. Thank you.
I want to get to what seems like the hard problem for me, and maybe this is talking about later, but I can see where we could, cut away the aggregates, cut away some confusion that the aggregates are a self. Think about like a car and driver. Like, I'm confused. I think the car is me. Like, oh, okay. Well, it's not my body. It's not my ideas. All these. But if we get down to like the very center, like the thing that drives karma, experiences karma in any given moment, and does not have access to the experiences of some other set of aggregates. Like, what is that, and how do you refute that as a self?
Yeah, well, and a couple things. One is that's exactly what he's going to get into, that question. And it's a really interesting point, right? Because like part of what I think what your question or your point is sort of implying is like that's what happens, isn't it? Or is it actually it's true, isn't it? So if we start meditating on emptiness, and this is what actually it's not just, this is why it's difficult, isn't it? Like Lama Tsongkhapa says it's difficult, is that I was even thinking this the other day, like even, say, the great Madhyamaka philosopher Bhava Viveka, right, who was one of the great philosophers of India, says, well, it can't just be merely labeled. There has to be something that experiences the results of karma and so on. That's more than merely labeled. And Chandrakuti says there is something that experiences the results of karma. It's the merely labeled. And that's the only thing that could possibly experience the results of karma. So that's, you're getting at a very subtle philosophical debate point in a way. Is, and Lama Tsongkhapa will get more into that. But there's a famous, like, you may remember, think of this, there's a famous, often quoted line from Arya Nagarjuna, right? Where he says, I'm not going to get the exact wording, but basically he says, in the emptiness, for one who understands the emptiness of inherent nature, all things are possible, including the creation of karma and the experience of the results of karma and the Four Noble Truths and the Three Jewels and so on. What's the way to say this right? If things were not empty, none of those things would be possible. And what's interesting is that other other philosophers, including say the mind-only school, disagree with Nagarjuna on that point. And they and then Nagarjuna in his text, the response to objections, he addresses that, and that's where that quote comes from, I think, if I remember correctly. Where they're saying, well, there has to be something existing from its own side, essentially. They don't use that phrase, but that's essentially what they're saying. To do what to experience the results of karma, and he says, only in the absence of that is it possible to have the experience of the results of karma. And we will get into that more, actually. Yeah, so I won't say too much, because we're actually, I think within a page or two, we'll get into some more about that. Where he starts to, Lama Tsongkhapa actually uses some quotes from those, not that exact quote, but to get at this point about it's only emptiness that allows one. It's because things are empty that's possible. That they sometimes say emptiness is what makes that tenable or understandable or possible, and in the absence of emptiness. But all other philosophical schools disagree with that, actually, isn't it? So they would suggest that for things to be dependently arisen, there has to be some kind of essence. Only the Prasangika say truly understanding dependent origination implies there is no essence or self-nature. So,
Sounds hard.
yeah. Jeff.
I'm not clear on this concept of the permanency of the label and what are the implications of that. That doesn't quite make sense to me. Can you walk through that?
To be honest, I can walk through it, and sometimes it doesn't make sense to me either, to be honest. Truthfully, it's true, but that actually comes in the if you study like the Tantrika tenet system. That's where that starts to be presented in detail, the Prasangikas don't refute that, but part of that is in the the Satantrika, not the Svatantrika, the Satantrika school. So it's one of the higher of the two Hinayana or Theravada, whatever, lesser vehicle schools. And so they draw an important distinction, and their school is very, very important. Their school of philosophy is like extremely important to understand the difference between impermanent phenomena, which are products of causes and conditions, and non-products, which they say are not changing moment to moment. We'll use that phrase, because permanent is sort of confusing, I think. In English, sometimes permanent seems to imply eternal. And they're not talking about eternal. They're talking about something that doesn't change instant by instant.
In what sense doesn't it change instant by instant? If I'm applying a label, right, if we're going through the process, and I'm merely imputing a label to something, that's based on that viewpoint at that moment under those circumstances, and that can easily change. I don't see where the permanency even comes into it.
In their school, what they sort of, the one way they talk about it, again, which I'm not sure if I totally understand, to be honest. For me, it's sometimes a point of confusion, because I actually think my own, it's hard for me to make sense of that. I think there are certain things they would categorize as permanent that it's hard for me to see how they're permanent, but that's just me. So, I'll argue from their perspective, because I don't think the Pratsangikas actually refute their perspective. And what they talk about is this, from their perspective, what they say is this, is when a child learns, like, I'm going to give a contrast here. If you were to see an elephant, right, walking across, like, in the zoo, that's clearly a product, right? It arose due to, many different causes and conditions. It's a functioning thing. These are synonyms, and that's in this sense. So it's a product. It's impermanent. It's a functioning thing, and it can give rise to effects. Like, for example, it could stomp on something, or it could have a child, a baby elephant. Whereas they say, when you learn the word elephant, and this is an important way they talk about it, they say that when you learn the word elephant, like that label, you learn it through elimination. And what they mean by that is that, for example, with a child, like, actually I remember this once, like, a Tibetan person I knew, when they saw like a raccoon for the first time, they said, "Is that a dog or a cat?" And then somebody said, "Oh no, it's not a dog or a cat, it's a raccoon." They said, "What?" And they said, they had to write it down, like raccoon, and then explain, like, and they had to kind of say, okay, so it's not a dog, it's not a cat, it's not a, what do you call it, like a squirrel, it's this other thing. And so that they're creating a kind of a conceptual label, and this is the school's view, is that, so these conceptual labels are created by recognizing it's not these other things. And in that sense, the label is, what's the way to say this right?
A limitation.
It's a, what's that?
A limitation.
It's a limitation. I was going to say it's also a, emptiness is a non-affirming negation. It's from their perspective, labels are affirming negations, actually. It's not a non-affirming negation in the sense that you're asserting something, that it is an elephant or whatever. But you're asserting it by negating that it's anything other than an elephant. And
Say that again?
that partly the function of the label is you're asserting that it is an elephant, and part of that is that you're asserting it's not something other. It's not a non-elephant. That's actually the way they talk about it.
So that's implying that there's a single label for any phenomenon.
For each and every.
Only one valid label for each object or phenomenon. That's the logical.
Times the number of sentient beings.
No, I'm just saying, we're involved in this analysis of the mental acrobatics that we go through to identify.
Actually, that wouldn't be correct though, because so for example, and the reason why that wouldn't be correct is so for example, even from their perspective, right? If there is, say I was learning your name, right? So I would say, okay, this is not Asley, and it's not Bob, and it's Jeff, or something But then in another, because it's conceptual, right? So another conceptual would be male, right? Okay, he's not female, so he's male. So it's the same phenomena, but it'll be a different eliminative process,
And I could give them
or
another label entirely.
what's that?
And I could call them Poopsie, another label entirely.
Yeah, no, that's true. And people could make up a nickname, and that would still be a valid.
Part of that definition in the Tibetan system is that generally a mental image goes along with it, which puts together I may not be doing this right, meaning generality.
Yeah, that's true.
So that's only valid in that moment. The basis is changing, but my meaning, my image that I have in my head of Jeff doesn't change until some other impetus, something else happens.
Yeah, that's
Later
correct.
I see you're older, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and that's right. That's
But
that.
so that image doesn't change
But
in
in
my
the way
head
that Lauren
until.
just said it, the way Lauren just said it, at that moment you have the moment of Jeff, the picture of Jeff, and all of a sudden you have the picture of male. Nothing has changed, but your perception has then put a different label on it, without any change. I'm not sure that means anything. I'm just.
So it has to change moment by, you're changing moment by moment, my image of you is not.
Well, part of that, actually, Jeff, just one last thing else. Part of what you were getting right there is that, and this is possible from that school's perspective and from this perspective too. We substitute one meaning generality for another, but that doesn't mean that the original one changed. That doesn't mean the original one changed. We can substitute a different one.
I understand that.
But what they're saying is they don't change. That image of Jeff doesn't change instant by instant. It's a kind of meaning generality, a mental image, you could say, that's not a product that's not changing instant by instant in the way that the body and the mind are. That's what they're saying.
Thank you.
So here he says, when the collection is posited as the basis of imputation, that which is collected is also posited as the basis of imputation. So we went through that. Now he quotes Chandrakirti. The sutras say that since it, meaning the I, depends on the aggregates, the mere collection of the aggregates is not the self. Right? So there he's just quoting Chandrakirti, making the same point we've been saying. And then he also, again, Chandrakirti, and this is first an objection. So the objection is somebody's arguing, the teacher, meaning the Buddha, said the aggregates are the self. if that's why you posit the aggregates of the self, and then and now here's the answer. That only refutes that the self is not the aggregates. For other sutras make statements like form is not the self. So what he's saying is, when Nagarjuna presented this perspective, right, which is that the aggregates are not identical to the self is labeled independence on the aggregates. Some people found a quote, would find a quote in a sutra that says, the aggregates are the self, right? And they would say, well, that contradicts what you, Nagarjuna, are saying. And here Chandrakirti is pointing out, well, there are other sutras that say the aggregates are not the self. And then he's saying there's a purpose behind those. And oftentimes this is like, as you say it right, like definitive and interpretable meanings of the Buddha's words, right? And so here what Chandrakirti is saying is, when the Buddha says the aggregates are the self, what he's doing is refuting somebody. He's saying that as a kind of a phrase, in other words, to refute somebody who thinks that there's a self that's apart from the aggregates. As if there's like a permanent Atman somewhere, like that's floating in space. Then to refute somebody who had that kind of view, he was saying, and we'll get into this more, but he was saying basically saying there, well, when I see you, I say, oh, here's Mike. There isn't some self that's completely apart from the aggregates. So the Buddha was using that phrase to make that point. And if you think that means the aggregates are actually the aggregates that the aggregates are actually the self from their own side in some intrinsic way, then you've misunderstood what the Buddha was saying in that quote. Does that make sense there? So in other words, this is Chandrakirti pointing out sometimes people misunderstood that the purpose of what the Buddha's sentence was, as if that means the aggregates are the self in some intrinsic way from their own side. And he's saying, no, that's not what he was saying. He was saying that for somebody who believes there's a kind of permanent, separate self that's apart from the aggregates, that the Buddha was refuting that, and he used that phrase, but he wasn't saying this, that the self is literally the aggregates from their own side in some intrinsic way. And then he says, and one proof for that is there are other sutras that extensively and in detail explain how the aggregates are not the self. So that's clear. Then he says, therefore, even the statement, the view of the eye and the mind by some ascetics or Brahmins is only a view of the five aggregates, refutes by means of the word only that the self is a different entity in the aggregate. Right, so here he's saying the self is not, and he's quoting the Buddha to say, the self is not one with the aggregates, right? It's not, you can't find the self from the side of the aggregates, but there's also not a self that exists somewhere apart from the aggregates. And so, in what way does the self exist? As a dependent arising, as that which is merely labeled on the dependence upon the aggregates. And so here he's just making this point in various ways. And what he's saying is, actually, so here he's saying also, and this is again a subtle distinction, right? That he's been drawing these kinds of distinctions numerous times. And I want to make a point. This is partly because when you refute the inherent existence of the I, right? If you misunderstand that point, then it's easy to fall into nihilism. Right? And actually, they say that Lama Tsongkhapa had all kinds of visionary conversations with Manjushri, right? It's famously known, and that they say that one of Manjushri's sort of advices to Lama Tsongkhapa was, help people understand the conventional and how that's in harmony with emptiness. Because Manjushri was concerned about nihilism, right? And so Lama Tsongkhapa makes great efforts, and they say that's one of his unique contributions, right? They say from a Sutrayana perspective, one of Lama Tsongkhapa's greatest contributions was this kind of teaching, these teachings, where he's showing the harmony of dependent origination, how conventional existence can exist while being empty. From a tantric perspective, the teachings on the illusory body were particularly profound. Things that he explained in a kind of way that was more clear or something, and more difficult to misunderstand than others had been able to put it into words. So here he's saying, he's making this subtle distinction though. He's saying, it's actually an interesting point, right? Like, which he said one other time previously. Here what he's talking about is, so there's the I that's the object of negation. That's an inherently existent I, right? That doesn't exist at all, even conventionally, and then we have to realize doesn't exist. Ultimately, doesn't exist conventionally. And now he's saying, but who is the person upon which that false, that non-existent false projection is projected, right? And he's saying, there is a person upon whom that's projected. It's the merely labeled person, which is labeled upon the basis of the aggregates, which does exist. And on that merely labeled person that exists in dependence upon, independence upon the aggregates, that's the mere self upon which one projects a truly existent, inherently existent self, which is the object that doesn't exist. So you get, it's quite a subtle distinction he's drawing here. Right, and he's drawing it because otherwise you could think you're refuting and he's making this point partly because we're about to meditate on the emptiness of the self, right? And he's making a point, he's saying, well, we're not refuting that the self, we're not saying the self doesn't exist at all, right? There is a self that's merely labeled, that exists as a mere dependent origination. And it's on the basis of that merely appearing, merely labeled self that we project a truly existent, inherently existent self, and that we then believe in that inherently existent self. And based on that, we give rise to all the mental afflictions and all the suffering that exists in the universe, right? So you get this very subtle distinction he's drawing, and he's drawing it because otherwise you could think, oh, there's no self at all. I'm going to refute that any self exists. And he's saying that's the wrong object of negation. The object of negation is the inherently existent self which you project upon the self that does exist. Actually, I shouldn't point here, I should point here. Right? The self that does exist, we project it on the self that does exist, which is the merely labeled self that is merely labeled on the basis of the aggregates, or independence upon, that's a better way to say it, independence on the aggregate.
So does, like, when you project aggregates, right? So does the delusion arises, or you have to wait until you project I for the delusion to arise?
Yeah, no, there's a delusion in both cases, but here we're focusing on the meditation on the emptiness of the self. So, in other words, believing the aggregates are inherently existent is a form of. Remember, he said earlier, there's the ignorance grasping at truly existent phenomena and persons, right? The two, that's the way I categorize it. So when we're grasping at the truly existent or inherently existent aggregates, that's a grasping at the self of phenomena. Then on the basis of that, we grasp at the self of the person. So both are a form of ignorance, but here he's focusing on how do you meditate on the emptiness of the person. So that's the emphasis here.
So if you negate the aggregates before you can reach to the I, then that will be okay.
Yeah, that's another way to meditate. What he's saying though is when we actually, he made this point though in the last section where he said, for Lama Tsongkhapa says, when we actually realize emptiness, he says, the first time a person realizes emptiness, it will be on the basis of their own self. So he's saying, so that's why he's emphasizing that first. But yeah, it's fine to also meditate on emptiness.
I don't know if this question's gonna make any sense at all, but is that self that we meditate on, that's empty, the self that reincarnates and has reincarnated and is timeless, is that the same? Is that the self?
Say what, I'm not sure if I totally get it.
Well, so the aggregates are imputed to label self as self.
So in dependence on the aggregates, we label self, right?
Yeah. And when meditating upon that, is it also correct that that self is the self that has been and always will be? That reincarnates in different aggregates and therefore different labels through time, but nonetheless the self.
It's interesting the way you phrase the question is, like I'll answer it in a complicated way. If we were to say, is that self, it's interesting in one way, actually it's interesting, like here's how I'll answer it. Like, I think this is the right way to answer. The correct, technically correct way to say it. Answer that would be, if we don't engage in ultimate analysis, right, about emptiness, if we're not thinking about emptiness, right, but if we're just looking at conventional existence, then we would say, correctly, right, that, you know, like, so say, and he's going to get into this later, but, you know, that, like, so say you, I don't know, say a person, say there's, he uses these kind of examples later in this text, like, so say there was a person who, in a past life, was a merely labeled, you know, existed as a merely labeled God in a heavenly realm, one of the heavenly realms, a God realm, a God realm, right? And then when that God being died, right? So you say, right? Like it depend. So you know, it's like it's a dependent origination, right? So a dependence upon that previous consciousness and the karma that being had created a human being. You know, like in dependence upon their karma, a human being. You know, the consciousness went into the bardo, and then a human being was born, and then there was a human being, right?
Merely labeled human.
Merely labeled human being. Yeah, exactly. And on the one hand, so like, and then we would just say that, right? And that's correct. Now, the reason why I was hesitating a little is that if you said, at one point you said, the same person, right? So that's a little problematic then, because there is, if we were to say, well, is the human being identical to the God? You said same. Like, so then we would say there's a problem there. Whereas, because they're not identical. Then we would say, are they inherently different? Well, they can't be inherently different. One depends upon the other. You know, or as I just hesitated when you said same, because they're not identical, of course. But we could say the one arose in dependence upon the other, and they both exist as merely labeled, and they're interdependently related. That all we could say. But if we say they're the same, then there's a problem, because that's starting to get into an ultimate question in a way. So that was why I hesitated a little.
But there's a sense in which they're the same self, which doesn't fit this analysis at all. I mean, there's a sense in which that self has gone through an incarnation and no other self fits that bill. So there is an identity between those two selves.
Relationship, maybe.
A relationship, I think, not an identity. Yeah, I don't think you could say there's an identity or a sameness.
You just created the idea.
Could we use an analogy of like a string of beads?
Yeah.
The continuum, and then the beads, the colors change, the form changes, but that string running through is a unifying factor.
I'm hesitating because I'm trying to think of unifying factors. Like,
Or connecting factor, or something that runs through all of those things.
But there really isn't something
But
that
that-
moves through all things,
Yeah.
it sounds like. I mean,
That-
it's really, it depends,
That
it
connects
depends on all
one
the.
to
That assumes there's some kind of consciousness permanent.
yeah, it's interesting. Like what you were saying. Actually, I think I'm just projecting because I'm not exactly sure, but I think like if one were to say, oh, there's like a string that connects all of them. Now this is my own projection, but that's closer to what the mind. I mean, I could make sense of that if I were debating or talking from a mind-only perspective. Then I could sort of use that in a way and say, well, you know, because the alaya would be that. Of course, but the Prasangika could say the alaya. Chandrakirti actually very explicitly, as a Prasangika philosopher, says, essentially, I mean, he doesn't use these words, but essentially says the alaya as a useful fiction to help people who are not yet ready to understand emptiness, but the alaya doesn't actually exist, even conventionally. It's just a fictional thing. So I mean, so from Chandrakirti's perspective, you know, the former life and the present life and the future life are, what's the word, dependently related. But if you were to try to find something that connects them, you wouldn't find that.
Because time isn't real.
Time isn't, time only exists conventionally.
But they're dependently related in only one way that relationship can exist. There is no other prior consciousness that can exist in that relation.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. So you guys get this point here, like, and then he's saying, he's making this point. I'll just read this sentence here. So anyway, you get the point. He was contradicting. He's contradicting the idea that that the self is one with the aggregate, so the self is different than the aggregate. Then he's saying, the reason for this is that out of the two, the observed object and the aspect of the apprehension of an I, if they were the observed object, they would have to be posited as the self. Therefore, the meaning of the sutra statement about viewing the aggregates must be explained as referring to observing the self that is imputed to the aggregates. And so what he's saying there is, and he's just making a, actually, sometimes in, how do you say it here, observed object and aspect of apprehension. So what he's saying there is just, there's a point, again, it's this philosophical point he's making, which is, like, the observed object is the object that does exist. It's the self that's merely labeled, right? And he said that very clearly. But then, how does he say it? The aspect of apprehension, in other words, how it appears to us, is not how it exists, right? So we don't perceive it as merely labeled by the line. We're perceiving it as it's appearing to us. Its aspect of apprehension to us includes the object of negation, actually. And now he's making this clear. He's saying that is why you should differentiate between the statements that the mere I, referred to as the self, conventionally exists, and statements that the inherently established person, referred to as the self, does not exist even conventionally. So this is what I've been talking about just a couple minutes ago, right? So he's making this point. He's saying it can be. Lama Tsongkhapa himself is pointing out this can be confusing, right? He's saying that here because he's saying you can use the word self, right? And sometimes the word self is referring to the merely labeled I, which does exist, right? As we've been talking about, and that exists in a past life and creates karma, and then experiences results of karma, and someday becomes a Buddha. And the Buddha says, "I went to Shravasti," and Buddha says, "In a past life, I was so and so." So that's the merely labeled I that exists. And sometimes in Buddhist texts, you'll read a self, and there's a self that exists. Other times you'll read a self, and it's the self as an inherently established person. He says, and this does not even exist conventionally, right? So he's saying the word self, you have to understand how is it being used, right? Is it being used in reference to the merely labeled self that's a mere dependent origination that does exist? Or is it being used to refer to the inherently established person which doesn't exist ultimately or conventionally?
But that sentence is confusing to me. Still you should not say that this system asserts that the self of persons to be conventionally existence. Seems like we were saying that we do say that a conventional person.
Actually, it should be.
It says, actually, if you look at the footnote of that one, it says conventionally existent in the sense that an inherently existent person is accepted as existing conventionally. So there, you see, it gets very subtle, isn't it?
Confusing.
So when it says here, still you should not say this system, meaning the Prasangika system, asserts a self of persons. Now, he's interesting. He's doing what he just talked about. I mean, he's using the word self, right? And we have to know which meaning of self is he saying. So here, that word self in that sentence is referring to the inherently established person, right? It's not referring to the mere person. So what it's saying is, so I'm going to restate that sentence using that. I'm going to use the full, if I use it that way. We say, still, you should not say that this system, the Prasangika system, asserts an inherently established self of persons to be conventionally existent.
I don't see how one could be asserted to be the other.
and here's here's an important distinction, why that may be important, is that the, this is the Prasangika Majamaka perspective, right? The Svatantrika Majamakas agree with the Prasangikas that ultimately there is no inherently existent, established person. But they assert that conventionally the person is inherently established. Just conventionally, not ultimately. So that's a difference. That's why when he's saying this is a unique thing about this system, meaning the Prasangika system, this sentence is actually differentiating the Prasangika system from the Svatantrika Majamaka system, who say their view is that there is no truly existent person, but there is an inherently established person.
I don't see that logic, I guess.
Oh, their logic,
I don't
or
understand their logic, I guess, that how you could say that.
their logic is actually similar to what some people were just saying in a way. Like what they would say is, their logic is, well, under ultimate analysis, they agree, because they're followers of Nagarjuna also. So they agree that under ultimate analysis, you can't find. Actually, under ultimate analysis, the self is empty of true existence. That's their perspective. But their perspective is, conventionally, the consciousness is the person, because that's what experiences the results of karma and takes rebirth and so on. So they would say, and that is established inherently on a conventional level, which the Prasangikas disagree with. So it's actually differentiating. He's differentiating the Prasangikas from the Svatantrikas there. When he says, and that's why he says, should not say this system asserts, right? Because he's differentiating that point. I think that's what he could also be differentiating them from the mind-only school and other schools, but I think there it's mainly differentiating from the Svatantrikas. He could be saying, that would also apply as a distinction from all the other schools, actually, because only the Prasangikas say there's no inherently established person. And that's why he says, such an identification of persons is a distinguishing feature of this unsurpassed system. Ascertaining this well is an excellent means of realizing the uncommon selflessness of persons. Right? So he's saying this is only the Prasangikas assert it in this way. And if you really, and actually, and he says it right there, doesn't it? That if you can understand this unique way in which the Prasangikas assert the merely labeled self, he says that, then, so I'm saying right here, ascertaining this well is an excellent means of realizing the uncommon self as a person. So what he's saying is, if you understand this, right, which is how the self does exist as a mere dependent origination, you'll understand selflessness, actually. Right? And it's a unique feature of the, in this sense also, right, that then by understanding, just by understanding appearances, you'll refute inherent existence. Which is again a unique feature of this presentation. Okay, so now we'll jump into this. So now he says, settling persons does not inherently exist. So now he's identified what is the person, right? All that was just to identify who we're talking about, right? Because we're going to talk about the self as a person. So he has to go into great detail about, so if we're saying we're going to talk about the self as a person, what's a person? And so actually, what he basically just said was, this is what a person is, and if you actually understand, Lama Tsongkhapa basically just said this, right? This is what a person is that which is merely labeled in dependence upon the aggregates. And then he just said, and if you actually understand what I just said about what a person is, you'll have already realized selflessness. But now, in case you haven't, he's going to describe how to meditate on selflessness. So settling the I does not exist inherently, right? It's not inherently existent. And so there are going to be 4 points. And these will, again, actually, so we're going into quite detailed, and you guys are seeing this, right? We're going into very detailed philosophical territory here, because that's what Lama Tsongkhapa is covering, right? And this is actually, this is one of Lama Tsongkhapa's, I think it's his final, this and, I forget which order, this and the text Ken Rinpoche's been teaching at the center, the Gompa Rapsel, the Illumination of Thought, the commentary to Majamaka Avatara, Chandra Kirti's, where Lama Tsongkhapa's 2 final texts on emptiness that present his kind of final definitive points about emptiness, like at the end, towards the end of his life. And this is one of them, right? So it's not an easy text. That was why when I said to Kiba Tensor Rinpoche, I said, should I just, I told you guys, I said to him, well, maybe I should just like do a summary, like brief. But he said, no, go over it in detail. I was like, okay, we'll try. Because it is difficult, isn't it? So, okay, so now he's going to present, how do you meditate on emptiness? And there are 4 points. Right? And this is the emptiness of the self. Right? And so the first point, well, actually, I'll just list them first, because he does, right? So so 4 essential points. First one is ascertaining the object of negation, right? Which we've been talking about. So you have to actually identify, and that means identifying in your own experience, right? Experientially. The second one is the essential point of ascertaining the pervasion. We're going to get into that in a minute, what that means. The third one is the essential point of seeing that the person and the aggregates are not one inherently established entity. And the fourth point is the essential point of seeing that the person and the aggregates are not established as essentially distinct. So those are the 4 points for meditation on emptiness. Now he says the first of them, which he's only going to say very briefly here. The essential point of ascertaining the object of negation. He says the first of the 4 essential points that exist with regard to this is to examine one's own mind so as to identify the manner of apprehending a self of persons. This was explained earlier. And so he's not going to go into detail here. This was explained earlier in this text, which we've been talking about it some, and it's actually explained in even more detail in his great treatise on the stages of the path. He has a very long section there that talks about correctly identifying the obligation. And that text, he goes into great detail about not identifying one that's too narrow and not identifying one that's too broad. He goes into a lot of detail explaining that because it's important. But again, here I'm just going to emphasize what he says here, right? Which is, this is to examine one's own mind, right? So this is the most, probably actually, in terms of actual meditation, this is the most important point. Because if you don't correctly identify the object of negation, everything else you do to meditate on emptiness is not going to be very useful. So we have to identify it, and it can't be something, he said this earlier in this text, right? This object of negation is not a philosophically acquired wrong view. This is the innate object of negation, which means it's, it's instinctual. It's something that you and I share with cats and dogs and insects. It's that instinctual, right? It's an instinctual way of misapprehending the self. And we have to, and it's the basis upon which we, as he says, it's very clear, it's the basis upon which we desire and hate and kill each other and steal from each other and lie to each other and do all the terrible things we've ever done. It's the basis of that. So it's that deep within us, right? This is not some philosophically acquired misunderstanding. It's an innate grasping, innate misapprehension and grasping. And we have to identify it experientially, and nobody else can identify that for you. Right? Each of us has to identify that in our own experience for ourselves, based on the words that they teach and based on instructions. But you have to do it, and in a sense, like to get it correctly, you have to do it over and over and over. Right? You have to. This is like you have to keep, and you have to do it in meditation, and you have to start doing it when you're walking around or when you're, that when you're upset, you say, "Who's the eye that's upset? Where is that eye? How do I find that eye?" When you're angry, you're checking. Well, who's the eye that's angry? When you're hurt, who's the eye that's hurt? And what way does that exist? And you're identifying the, you're looking for the object of negation. You're trying to become familiar with the object of negation. Okay, then the next point is the essential point of ascertaining the pervasion. And all Lama Tsongkhapa says at first about that, well, he starts off, actually there are a number of points, but he says, so this point, the pervasion, is the decision that if a person is inherently established, it must be established as either one entity with or different from the aggregates. And there is no means of establishment other than these two. And I wanted to pause here and say, like, this term pervasion, like, I think apart from in Buddhist, like, I mean, actually, you all know the word pervade, right? Because you could say, like, I mean, you know that word in the sense, like, if you said, if you had whatever, like say a little bit of sand, and you poured water in, and the water eventually pervaded all the sand. Actually, yesterday I made rice, right? And I put the rice in the rice cooker, and then I poured enough water so that the water pervaded the rice, right? It was above the level. So all the rice was pervaded by water, right? So the water, it means it covers everything, right? In normal English. Right? But actually, in terms of pervasion, using that word philosophically, actually, apart from it, but I don't think we ever hear that. Right? I mean, I was thinking back, because I was preparing for today, I was like, oh yeah, like, apart from in the Buddhist context, and actually I was checking, like, so, it's actually, I was trying to see, actually, I mean, in the Tibetan Buddhist context, I studied it quite a bit, but it actually comes from Hindu, I mean, it comes from Buddhist and Hindu both philosophy. It's a philosophical term from, that actually, I didn't know this, but in Sanskrit it's Vyapti. And so it's this idea of pervasion. So the idea of pervasion, though, is that something pervades all of something else, right? And actually, then I was thinking, it's like in school, you know, when you were a kid in school and they would show, what do you call it, like, you know, there were things that overlapped and then there were something, but then if like this was, you know, if there was a circle and then there was another circle bigger than it, then the one circle pervaded the other.
Venn diagram.
Venn diagrams, yeah. I was like, oh, it's talking about that. Like, so we actually learned, we didn't use the term pervasion. When I was a kid, they didn't use that term for this. But they're getting at that idea. It's the, you know, this term, Vyapti from Indian philosophy is getting at what Venn diagrams get at. Right? And so, and one point is that if you think about it, so they're talking about categories, right? And they're saying, and actually, if you think of it this way, like, so if two circles are like this, then neither one pervades the other. Actually, if two circles like this, definitely neither one pervades the other. But even if they're like this, neither one pervades the other because there's just some overlap, right? But if one circle encompasses another, then the smaller circle is pervaded by the larger, right? But then also, if two circles are identical, if you took two circles and you overlaid one on the other, and you said these two categories now are like that, then there would be a forward pervasion and a reverse pervasion, right? Each would pervade the other. Does that make sense? And so it's actually a term, you could say in logic, actually, right? We're talking about logic and sort of, you know, basic philosophy here. Now,
you could say it's like going to an all-inclusive resort with everything.
an all-inclusive resort, that's what includes everything. That's what. And now, I want to share something, a quote, actually. And this is why why are we talking about pervasion? You could ask yourself, well, why is Lama Tsongkhapa suddenly bringing up this philosophical point about pervasion? And here's the point, is what we're trying to get at is an inferential realization of emptiness here. So a realization of emptiness that comes about through inference, through reasoning, right? Inferential reasoning. And here's the quote I was going to. The instrumental cause of an inferential realization is the knowledge of pervasion. So in other words, you have to understand the pervasion in order to come to a inferential realization of emptiness. And a direct realization of emptiness will only come later, depending upon, because everything's dependently arisen. So if you're going to someday have a direct realization of emptiness, it will come about through independence upon your previous inferential realization. So now you need an inferential realization. That's what we're studying now, right? At this point, which will then lead to a direct realization. And in order to have an inferential realization of emptiness, you have to understand that the pervasion in this case. And I thought, you know, like oftentimes when this is taught, sometimes people don't stop that long to talk about what is that. But let's stop a little bit and talk about it. So, there are typical examples, and I'm just going to give a couple. Like, one that they sometimes they use this when they're talking about this topic to understand it is, so you could say, like they. Actually, I wrote one here. So here's an inferential. Here's a statement that one might use, that's sometimes used to get at this word of inference and pervasion. The mountain has fire because of the smoke. And the idea here is that the presence of thick billowing smoke is pervaded by the presence of fire. So what they're saying is there's never an instance of thick billowing smoke without fire. Actually, they were saying, there's smokeless fire. So there's not a reverse pervasion necessarily, right? and they gave the example, if you set, sometimes if iron were burning, it might not produce smoke. But smoke always is a product of fire. So if you see smoke and you know that all instances of thick billowing smoke are pervaded by the presence of fire, then when you see thick billowing smoke coming out, well, forget the mountain. If you saw thick billowing smoke coming out of your neighbor's house, you would scream, "Fire!" and you would call the fire department, right? And you know, it's just to help others, right? In that sense. So, and that's actually, so what they're getting at here is we often, in normal life, use pervasion, use our knowledge of pervasion to come to logical conclusions about something. In the same way, right? Like, yeah, anyway, get the point. And so I'm going to go through, like, and actually I'm going to go through a little bit now the form of a logical argument. Which, let's go through it. So, in that case, the thing being proven is fire, right? The pervasion is that the presence of fire pervades the presence of thick billowing smoke. And the sign, or the reason is smoke, right? So in other words, you see the thick billowing smoke, you know that all instances of thick billowing smoke are pervaded by the presence of fire, and so you know there's a fire, and then you take some action, you call the fire department. Now, if you, I'm trying to decide how far to go into this, but I'll give one more example. Now, another typical example, I'm just going to go through, I'll mention it briefly, is, this is often used in Buddhist, Buddhist context, in the Majjhimaka context, is the sprout, or a small plant, is empty of inherent existence because it's dependently arisen. Now, there, the subject of the discussion, of course, is the sprout. Right? The thing being proven is empty of inherent existence. The reason is dependent origination. Right? Now, if you don't know, if you don't experience, I mean, you may intellectually say, "Oh, Lama, whatever, Tsongkhapa and Chandrakirti and Nagarjuna said this," but if you don't know, clear in yourself, not through somebody else's words, but in a clear, logical way, that all instances of dependent, actually in this case is a forward and reverse pervasion. All dependently arisen things are empty of inherent existence. All things that are empty of inherent existence are dependently arisen. Right? Are dependently arisen. That's right. So it's interesting, right? So if you don't know that those categories, if you don't know experientially for yourself, through your own contemplation, that there's a pervasion between empty of inherent existence and dependently arisen, then when you hear that sentence, you don't realize emptiness. Right? As soon as you realize that pervasion, then when you hear that sentence, you realize emptiness. That's why, going back to what I said earlier, pervasion is the instrumental cause of an inferential realization of a thing. So we have to. So earlier I said we have to experientially and in our own mind, as Lama Tsongkhapa says, in our own experience, we have to identify the object of negation. But we also have to actually come to an understanding, a genuine understanding for ourselves of the pervasion. And if we don't, then we'll say like, somebody will say the sprout is empty of inherent existence because it's dependently arisen, and we'll say, okay, whatever. Like either we'll say I don't agree, or we'll say okay, but it won't have any effect on us because we don't actually understand that pervasion, right? We don't really understand what does dependently arisen mean, or we don't understand what is empty of inherent existence really mean, and we don't understand the relationship between those two things, right? So we don't really understand if they're like this, or like this, or like this, and so therefore when somebody says that sentence, we don't have any realization, right? Does that make sense? And so here, we have to actually have some understanding of the pervasion for ourselves, or else this meditation won't have much impact. We'll just say, you'll meditate on is the self one with the aggregates, is the self something apart from the aggregates, and it'll sort of be an interesting exercise. It may be useful in some way, but you won't actually come to any realization because you don't understand the pervasion. So now I'm going to go back, right? And I'm going to read what he said again in the context of that discussion of probation. So the second, he says, decision or clarity, or something like that, the second point is that if a person is inherently established, it must be established as either one entity with or different from the aggregates. And there is no means of establishment other than these two. Right? So that means, right, so I'm going to give, now I'm going to go back. So earlier it was like smoke and fire, right? And, or inherent, dependent origination and empty of inherent existence. Here, what's being pervaded, right? So let's go through this sentence here. He's saying, means of establishment, right? Or inherently established, right? So what he's saying is, if a person were to be, so the one category is a person who is inherently established, right? So what is, and actually you'd have to contemplate now. I read that sentence the first time, probably going, oh, okay, whatever. Like, but now you have to think, well, what is inherently established? Right? So and there are many synonyms, right? Inherently established, or established from its own side, or there's a phrase he uses another place here, like, you know, like self-created in a sense, independent, intrinsic existence. Yeah, there are many different synonyms for this, right? But here he used this phrase, inherently established, right? So, and what he's saying is the category, right, of inherently established person, if it exists, which is not yet, you know, which may not. I'm giving you a hint there, of course. But so the inherently established person, right? And then he's saying must be pervaded by, or is pervaded by either being one entity with the aggregates, or a different entity from the aggregates. And then he says, and there is no other way it could possibly be established. Does that make sense? So if there's an inherently established person, and so you have to come to some realization that these two categories are all inclusive. Does that make sense? Like there is that every possible way an inherently established self could exist is included in these two categories. Inherently, how do you say it? Inherently one entity with, or intrinsically different from the ideas.
So logically, it's mutually exclusive relations.
Yeah, and part of that is like, it's like saying, I mean, actually, if you think about this deeply, right, you have to do that. You actually have to stop. I mean, if you're going to meditate, at some point, if you're going to meditate on emptiness using this technique, right, you would actually have to stop and think, maybe for hours or days or a few weeks even, about, well, is that true? And what does that mean, right? And in part, like, you know, if you say let's say one entity with or different from the aggregates, and we're going to go into a little more detail in a minute, but it's a bit like saying, actually it'd be like this, it'd be like saying, if, you know, if a cup exists, it has to be either on this table or someplace other than being on this table, right? And part of what you're saying is, well, that is an all-inclusive, or is it, if you say it's on the table or it's somewhere other than on the table, that's an all-inclusive, there is no other place in the universe that's not, you know, like that. So here, one entity with the aggregates or a different entity from the aggregates. But so you'd have to think about it. So, and again, you get the point here. So you have to really contemplate, what does it mean to be an inherently established person? You know, and if there is such a thing, right, that exists from its own side, right, that exists intrinsically from its own side inherently, is there some way it could exist other than one with the aggregates or other than the aggregates? And you'd have to come to a realization, in a sense, or a recognition, or a clarity, an understanding, a clear understanding. Yeah, there is no other way it could possibly exist. It has to be one of those two categories. And if you haven't understood that, right, then you won't. You know, in other words, that's what he's saying. Right? He's saying it very clearly. You have to come to that recognition from yourself, not based on somebody else's saying it, but based on your own contemplation, a kind of clarity like, yeah, those really are all inclusive, and there's no other way an inherently established person could exist but those two. And then, of course, you'll have to say, well, okay, but maybe it exists in one of those two ways then, right? So that's, you get where this is heading then. Does that make sense? But if you start searching, this is what happens sometimes. If you start just searching for the self, sometimes you'll sometimes come across a Buddhist text that either doesn't get clear about the object of negation, or it doesn't get clear about the probation, and just starts looking for the self, right? Is this on the body? Is this on my finger? Is this on my... And that's okay. I mean, it's actually it's an okay starting point, but you're not going to realize emptiness until you realize the probation. Does that make sense?
It could be neither of the two.
And that's what, so I said, and this is what he's getting at here. So he's saying, Lama Tsongkhapa is suggesting here, there is nothing that's neither of the two. So that's a non-existent category, right? And so you have to check, do you agree or disagree? So, I mean, maybe you're disagreeing with Lama Tsongkhapa, and then you have to present, is there an example of something that would be neither? So he's suggesting there is no such thing as a neither. That everything is included in either one with the, one entity with the aggregates or a different entity with the aggregates.
Then I've seen emptiness at that point, I guess. If I say neither of the two.
Yeah. So you'd have to think, what does it mean? Is there such a thing that's neither of the two? Right? And what would that be? And could a self be inherently established that's neither of the two?
Except that conventionally it has to exist, otherwise I'll be heading towards nihilism.
But again, as you know, it conventionally inherently established self doesn't exist. He just said that. You just said the inherently established self has to exist. He said on the previous page, it doesn't exist, even conventionally.
Without nature.
But that's not inherently established. Inherently established means having its own nature. That's a synonym, actually, right? But here he says, the inherently established person. So that means a person that exists by its own nature. So he just said it doesn't exist, even conventionally. Are you saying that does exist conventionally?
I mean, it has to function. I mean, if it doesn't function, then it becomes tricky.
And part of what Lama Tsongkhapa was saying was, the thing that functions is the mere I, not the inherently established. There is no inherently established I.
Yeah, the mirror.
But here he's saying inherently established I. Right? This sentence says, the decision that if a person is inherently established, right? So that's not the mere I, that's the inherently established I, the object of negation.
Oh, okay.
Again, what he just said, we have to keep it's good that you brought this up, right? Because on the previous page he was saying we have to always keep identifying which self are we talking about. The merely labeled self that does exist conventionally, or the inherently established self which doesn't exist ultimately or conventionally at all. Right? And here he's talking about the object of negation, which is the inherently established one, which doesn't exist even conventionally. So we have to be very clear. That's why actually great. It's good you asked that question because you're proving Lama Tsongkhapa's point, actually, right? Where he said we have to be very clear to differentiate those two. And so if we don't, then it becomes confusing. What are we refuting the mirror I that does, as you said, that does experience karma and does have it, and he said, but no, this is the inherently established I, right?
But
Which
the
doesn't
source is the
exist.
same, right?
What's that?
But the source is the same, right? The source for both of them is the same.
No, it's different.
Because it's labeled upon the mind, which is one, right?
No, because a Buddha has a merely labeled self, but a Buddha doesn't experience an inherently established.
But it comes from one mind. That is mere and imputed too.
Actually, no. I mean, if you think about it, like the mind grasping at an inherently established self is a mind of ignorance. The mind realizing the lack of an inherently established self is a wisdom. You're saying they're the same. They're not the same.
Yeah, but the wisdom is wisdom, right? But where does wisdom come from?
Wisdom comes from a process of reasoning, and ignorance comes from a process of
Emptiness,
grasping.
right? Emptiness, right?
Oh, you're making the same point you were trying to make last time.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out
Oh, I see.
because
No, I get it.
there has to be a source, right? There has to be something like we give a name, we give a label. There has to be a base somehow, some way, and that base has to be, of course, come out of emptiness. There has to be a base.
One thing we have to differentiate there, though, is like emptiness is in one sense, we can say it's a source in the sense that things arise or things are possible because they're empty. But it's not actually the functional source, right? It doesn't serve as a cause in the sense of like there's like it's a necessary condition for things to arise, but it's not the actual cause. Like you can't like. Whereas the substantial cause of ignorance is a previous moment of ignorance. So emptiness is not the substantial cause of ignorance. Emptiness is a necessary condition for ignorance to function, but it's not the substantial cause of ignorance. The substantial cause of ignorance is previous moment of ignorance.
Which is energy, right?
Yeah, and again, emptiness is a non-affirming negation, whereas ignorance is a functioning phenomenon. Functioning phenomenon.
Which can be negated.
Yeah.
It's all pervasive phenomenon.
Ignorance is not all pervasive. And then you're asserting a Buddha has ignorance.
No, at least for me.
One quick question, just quick clarification. You mentioned the word inferential when you were discussing. Is that the same as the conceptual versus non? That's the same as conceptual realization.
Oh yeah, of emptiness. Yes, yeah, right, yeah, that's right. Or if we say a conceptual realization of emptiness, or a realization, or a inferential realization of emptiness, that would be similar. Yeah, similar. I guess like the only reason I'm hesitating is like so there's the direct realization of emptiness is non-conceptual, right? I'm trying to think. The thing I'm trying to remember is like if you hear. That would be called, I guess that's not really, what I'm thinking about is this, is like when we hear about emptiness and we gain a kind of intellectual understanding that's not yet an inferential, it's an interesting question, would that be, I'm not sure if we call that, I don't think that you can call that a realization exactly. Sometimes they'll talk about it that way, but here we're talking about like, the inferential realization is conceptual, so, yeah. Did you
No, never mind.
Okay. So I'll just continue on because he's continuing to talk about the pervasion, right? So he says, and actually I'm going to summarize this because I think the translation they use this word here. They translated they use this word accompanied and unaccompanied, which I think is extremely difficult to understand. I think other translators use you can use instead of accompanied, we can say plural or many or not singular, and then for unaccompanied we can say single or one or so I think that's much simpler because I find unaccompanied quite cumbersome to sort of I find that a cumbersome translation for that phrase there, but so what he's saying though is this is so first of all, I'll read the header here. Since singular and plural, I'm going to use those. So since singular and plural, or one and many, I could say, since one and many form a general direct opposition, a third alternative to one and many is excluded. And so here, again, we have to think, to be honest, I think you have to think quite deeply, because if something were merely labeled, this wouldn't apply. Right? This point that he's making wouldn't apply. This is applying, he's saying if something is inherently established, right, or exists by its own nature, or exists from its own side, then what he's saying is it has to be a single thing or a plural, or many things, it has to be one or many things. So it has to be one thing or many things that are truly established. And if it's truly established, it can't be. It has to be. So it has to be one of those two. Let's go on. Now he says, and now he's giving an example. He says so he gives the example of pot and pillar, right? And so he's saying that if you're going to think about something, maybe a way of saying this is existing by its own nature, right? I'm going to use that phrase. So if you were to think that a pot exists by its own nature, then it's not a pillar, right? And if you were to think a pillar exists by its own nature, it's not a pot, right? Because and you can think in terms of their form, but also their function, right? A pot holds liquid, and a pillar supports a roof, right? And And you'd have to say, well, those are two different, those are two entities. They're not identical, but they're not one entity. And he's saying, like, they can't be, if they exist by their own nature, they can't be, what's the say right? They have to either be sort of one entity that's identical, or they have to be separate entities. Now, again, you have to think, I'm just pausing, because he's not saying this in detail, he's not making this point explicitly here. But you have to actually think about it some, right? Because, as I say, right? So if the pillar existed by its own nature, it would have to be a pillar, right? And not a pot. And not a lamp. And not a microphone, right? Whatever. Like, it's a pillar, right? And it exists as a pillar. And it can't exist. And so the point he's getting here is, let's go through it. So he's saying, I just want to get the second part here. When you determine that something is unaccompanied, something like pot, you eliminate. So what he's saying is, if you look at a pot and a pillar, right? So you have to determine, are they one entity or are they separate entities? And they can't be both, right? And if you determine, well, they're separate entities, they're not identical, then that, so you're saying they're not, that implies they're singular, right? That each one is a singular entity that exists separate from the other. And that's that. It's a definitive, it's like a definitive and, what's the word? Like mutually exclusive. They can't be both, right? If it's singular, then it's not, so if it's a pot and a pot is different than a pillar, then it's singular. Right? Whereas if you were to say there are 4 pillars in this room, then you could say, well, they're all one category, they're all pillar. And then he says here, consequently, you are made to ascertain that to be neither one entity nor different entities is impossible. Right? And do you understand? I just want to make sure people get this. Like, he's getting at entity here, right? He keeps using this word entity. And because these categories, right? Because he started by saying, if a person is inherently established, then they have to be either one or many, right? Now he's saying the same thing, right? If something is inherently established, it has to be one or many, right? Anyway, I'll pause there because I don't want to, I can say more about it, but do people have questions about this? Yep.
So is he saying also that accompanied and unaccompanied makes no impact on you? Is that the point of the accompanied?
Actually, so accompanied was just this translator's translation of many, and unaccompanied was this translator's translation of one, which I think is confusing translation personally. Like, I think maybe he was doing a literal translation from the Tibetan or something, but it's confusing. So that's why I'm using one or many, because I find it confusing to say it's not the way it's usually translated, to be honest.
Well, kind of it's confusing and kind of it's a little clarifying, because I'm thinking about, like, going to the Venn diagram, just thinking in terms of Venn diagrams, having 2 separate entities, right?
Mhm.
That can be one or the other, can't be both. unless
Yeah, so
they
this would be 2,
merge.
right. Yeah, so that would be 2 circles that are,
Right.
yeah. Something that's one can't be many, and something that's many can't be one, so they would be 2
Yeah.
separate. In a Venn diagram, they would be 2
But
separate.
accompanied could be a third option, logically, until it refutes it.
What's that? Until what?
It appears to refute that creates another entity, accompanied, as unaccompanied as many.
Yeah, so you're saying there is no third alternative, right? Yeah. A third alternative, so he says here, a third alternative, something that is neither one nor many, does not therefore exist, right? So there is no other category, yeah. And so, and the point there is, if you understand that, then you understand that everything has to exist in one of those 2 categories, right? If it's established. If it's inherently established, or if it has its own entity, then it has to be one of those 2 categories. And do you see how that, personally, I think that would take a lot of contemplation, wouldn't it? Like, to really understand what he's getting at there, like, is that really true? And if you don't come to a clarity for yourself, then you would continue to think, well, maybe there is a third category. Right? So you have to be clear for yourself. This is what Buddhism is asserting. You have to assert you have to be clear for yourself. Do you agree? Is that clear to you? Do you cognize that?
So, Dr. Lawrence, just a thought here. So, we use this conventionally all the time, saying all of us are unique. Like, in a sense, all 7.3 billion people that we have, and human beings on Earth, are unique. In a way, they are all singular, product of their karma. Can I think that way when we say singular in terms of what are we? Conventional.
I didn't hear anything you said.
Do you want to say it louder, or she can hear you?
Sorry.
It's just a rambling. So I was saying, like, conventionally, we always talk about all human beings are unique, right? We keep on hearing, like, Fidel is unique, Jeev is unique, whatever. So tying that back to this, like, all 7.3 billion people that we have, somehow we are unique in a sense that we're all singular, a product of our karma.
And part of what's, again, this is what your question to me, this is why I'm glad that she's asking this question. This is, I think, part of what one would have to start contemplating. If one was going to do this meditation, if one were actually doing this meditation, right, one would have to contemplate points like this, right? Because so you would say, well, like you might think, well, wait a second, like, I'll give an example, right? So let's say you start thinking about what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, right? So then you would think, well, like, because Rajiv was saying everybody's unique, right? So you might say, okay,
Everybody is a singular product of their karma, a singular in a sense that, in terms of karmic point of view.
so from one perspective, so I'm just giving you that, right? So,
Conventionally, I mean, we're not talking about inherent stuff here.
so you might say, okay, so if I'm sitting and thinking, I might think, well, I'm me, so I'm unique, so I'm singular. But then you might say, I'm part of my family, right? So then I'm
Dependent origination right there.
multiple. I'm part of a group. Then you might say, I'm also part of a country. And then there are many different categorizations, right? And if you start to contemplate that deeply, again, when you start to realize, this is where, remember that quote I said from Negation, if things are empty, meaning dependently arisen, all things are possible, right? But if something exists, now you're starting to get at the point here. If you start to think, well, if things exist by their own entity, right? Like if I'm inherently just me, singular, then how can I be part of a group? Right? It would be impossible. Like in other words, you can't be both inherently singular and inherently part of a group. And actually, then you see like, and actually, I'll get away. Like you see sometimes when somebody like say, I'm just giving actually, if you're really contemplating this deeply, you start to think many points like that. You see like, okay, when somebody like retires from a job, they had some idea I was part of this, and then they are not part of that. And then they are like, it's difficult actually, right? Because they had some feeling I'm intrinsically part of that, right? Now I'm intrinsically not part of it, and but I'm supposed to be intrinsically part of that, and it comes from thinking that things are inherently established, actually, right? Because there was you were just labeled part of a particular group, and you're labeled not part of that group, and like you were never, and actually like Ken Rinpoche often makes this point. He often uses the example of different, but there is like, well, like you use the example of like how it's dependently arisen, right? Like in other words, so if sometimes he would use the example of president, right? Until inauguration day, a person's not a president. Then after the next president is inaugurated, they're not a president. But in between, their aggregates are the basis for the label president. But there's no president from its own side, right? Or like any job you have, right? Whereas if you get hired, then you're labeled. Oh, you're this, and it's a correct basis for a label, that. Right? But there's nothing from your own. If you were an engineer, inherently, then you'd have to be an engineer while you were in your mother's womb, right? When you came out, it's like self-proclaimed engineer or something. Like it's not possible, right? So and this is part of what we're getting at is what does it mean to be inherently established, right? What does it mean to be exist from its own side, right? And if it existed from its own side, then it would have to actually be, truly be one, or truly be many, right? But if it's, but otherwise, because actually if it's not as, if something can be one and many, right, then it doesn't exist inherently. So if each person is, actually if you can say each person's unique and we're all the same, then persons can't be established inherently, right? Like, because people say that, right? On one hand, people say everybody's unique. Then also some they say, oh, we're all the same, right? We all have two eyes. We all have whatever, we all want to be happy. We're all the same. But if you can say we're all the same, and then you can say we're all unique, then that's not an inherently established person. But if there's an inherently established person, they have to either be unique or they have to all be the same. They can't be both, because that's just some conceptual label. Then they only exist in mere name, actually. So you're getting at, these are the things we have to contemplate when you're contemplating, like he's just saying this in a very simple set of, not simple, but a small number of words. Not simple words, actually, but a small number of words. But if you start contemplating it deeply, you start asking all these kind of questions, and then you start to understand what he means by inherently established. Like an inherently established person, right, has to be self-substantiating, in a sense. It can't be dependent upon causes and conditions. It can't be dependent upon parts, right? It can't be dependent upon a label, right? Because if it's dependent upon that, actually, if the person is dependent upon parts, the aggregates, right? If it's dependent upon the aggregates, then it's not one with the aggregates, right? And it's not inherently established then. So it would have to be inherently established as the aggregates from its own side in some kind of stable, real way. And that's part of what we're contemplating here, right? And until you contemplate that, you can't understand the probation, actually, right? What does it mean to be inherently established as one or as many? So if it's inherently established, it can't be, you can't say, oh, well, sometimes I'm going to talk about it as one, and sometimes I'm apprehended as one, and sometimes I'm apprehended as many. Then it's not inherently established.
So the only possibility, Dr. Lauren, would be that something is a permanent phenomenon, and it's inherently existent. Would that be right?
So you see, I mean, he said, so if something, he said maybe it's possible that if something were a permanent phenomenon, then it would be inherently existent. That was Rajiv's point. And again, this is part of what we start to I mean, it's good that you're asking these questions, right? Because this is what we start to contemplate as we contemplate. Well, then would the self be permanent? Example, right? You would say, well, maybe there could be a permanent self that's really one thing, right? And so then it would be singular, right? And then we'll get into how you refute that. But according to, actually we'll get into, it's in the text here. Eventually we'll get to a point where Lama Tsongkhapa refutes, gives various presentations to refute the idea that permanent phenomena are inherently existent. So he would say, no, they're not inherently existent. And there are many examples, like, so we say that, for example, space is an example of something that's, they say, space is not in the sense of outer space, but unobstructedness. But then they say that's dependent upon its parts. There's the upper part of the lower part. Parts exist in the east and west, and then on those we label space, so that they still exist. Even though it's not, permanent phenomena don't depend on causes and conditions, but they depend on their parts and on labels still. So they're not inherently existent. So that you have to say anyway. So there are many ways to contemplate this and refute various, to sort of that are traditionally used to refute that, But you're getting the right point, which is you have to, as you start to contemplate this, you start to say, well, what would an inherently established self be? Is it something permanent or impermanent? Is it possible for something to be impermanent and be singular? But then it's made up of moments, right? So that's problematic. We're going to get into that soon, but so then it's not really singular, So if something exists in time, can it be singular? Because it's made up of moments.
That's momentary, still continuum.
So it's a continuum, so a continuum is made up of parts, so that it's not singular. And then if you were to say, well, then each of those moments is an inherently established, so we'll get into that more, but then you start to go, well, that's not tenable either. So you start to realize, as you contemplate this more and more, you start to realize the problem of trying to assert an inherently established self, right? But then again, here he's saying, but if it truly exists as inherently established, it has to be one singular or plural, so one or many, is this point. And so we have to contemplate until we really come to a recognition there is no third category. Good.
Well, maybe just to clarify, so that in your example of the person leaving a group, so if I'm not thinking of that as me, like as a person, but as an experience, how do you analyze that? Like if I separate that experience from me being in retirement as a separate experience, then I'm not thinking of it as a person, but as an experience. How would I analyze that and say that does not exist of its own side either? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and part of it, I guess, is like, again, like, in order to differentiate what Lama Tsongkhapa said from the previous page, like, where he talks about there's the self, the merely labeled self that does exist, and there's the inherently existent self that does not exist, right? And so part of it is like, there's the merely labeled self, that does exist conventionally, right? Can be labeled as part of a group, right? It's flexible. And actually part of what's interesting is when we recognize that the self exists in that way as merely labeled independence upon the aggregates, then as long as Nagarjuna says all things are possible, right? So there's all kinds of possibilities. Like for one, there are all kinds of possibilities one can say, but also Ken Shermshe often points this out, or has pointed this out. He said, so if somebody has understood emptiness, in this, even with inferential realization like we're talking about here, then that person would be very flexible, actually. Or it's because they know experientially, okay, like now due to causes and conditions, this experience is arising, and it's just an appearance. It's a temporary, fleeting appearance, like a career, right? Even for example, like it's just a temporary, due to all kinds of causes and conditions, and the way our culture labels somebody, and certain whatever, like actually many different causes and conditions. A person's education, and somebody hired them, and therefore they're labeled as this. But the person would sort of be very, what's the word? If they wouldn't grasp at that as somehow really me, in a way. They would know it's like an illusion-like appearance. That's sometimes the way they use the phrase. That an illusion-like not in the sense that it doesn't exist at all, but illusion-like in the sense that it's just appearing because of a whole bunch of causes and conditions, and when those causes and conditions change, then it won't appear that way. And so that person would actually be quite flexible. And they wouldn't, when they're in a certain role, they wouldn't identify with that role in some kind of concrete, rigid way or something. They would kind of, they would be in the role in a kind of flexible way. And that's part of the problem, isn't it? Is that when we grasp, this is what, but as we grasp at an inherently existent I, and then we grasp at these different roles, then if somebody threatens our role, we could want to kill them or something. We get angry at them, and then if we, somebody, and that's all because we're holding on to those things in a very concrete way. Whereas the person who has some understanding of emptiness, the more they understand emptiness, the more flexible and the less they don't take those things as inherently established anymore, right? They take them as mere labels. And a mere label is not something that exists in mere name, isn't grasped at in the same way, and therefore that person has more flexibility in stepping in and out of roles, or in, and so on. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Maybe we'll stop, I guess, because we're running out of time, so we'll stop there. I guess I just want to suggest something, which is to, my suggestion is this, is for those who, for those who are interested in this topic of emptiness, to actually contemplate this point, we've talked a lot up to now about the object of negation, but now we're getting to this topic of pervasion, which I personally think actually, as I think, it's a topic that, let's say right, that people sometimes gloss over, I think. People who are interested in emptiness oftentimes will meditate on, we'll often go right into the next parts of the meditation, and don't spend long enough contemplating the pervasion, and if you don't, and Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, I'm not making it up, right? Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, if you don't understand the pervasion, you won't gain the inference, right? You won't gain the inferential realization. And so it's something that we have to spend time thinking about. Like, is that true? And is it really, because whereas when I'll just make this last point and I'll stop. Like, if you're outside going back to my analogy from earlier, like if you're outside your neighbor's house and you see billowing smoke coming out, right? Like, you don't say like, the pervasion, right? So you're not saying like, wow, that billowing smoke could be that there's a fire and people might die, but are all instances, like, you've already come to the conclusion. You're not like, but maybe some instances of smoke don't have fire, and like, and like debate the firemen or something. No, don't go in there yet. Let's figure out if there's really fire. Like, because there's a clarity in your mind about the pervasion. Actually, you don't use that term, but whereas when you see billowing smoke, you know there's fire, right? And I guess my point is like, if we were going to use this method to understand emptiness, which is what Lama Tsongkhapa is suggesting for us, we have to come to that level of clarity, right? Like that so we have to know the object of negation, an inherently established self of persons, right, meaning oneself. If it exists, just as clear as you know if there's billowing smoke, there's fire, you have to know if it exists, it's got to be either one with the aggregates or different from the aggregates. And you'd have to know that like in a definitive way, right? Just like the billowing smoke example. Then when you move on to meditate on the other parts, you'll come to some kind of experience, right? Otherwise, again, not that it's not useful, any contemplation can be useful, but for inferential realization, you have to become extremely clear about this point, which means really thinking, well, what is an inherently established self? Why would it have to be one with or different from the others? Is there some other way of existing? Lama Tsongkhapa, Chandrakirti, Nagarjuna say there's not. Maybe I think there is. Well, what would that be? And you have to kind of go through a whole process for yourself until you come to a clarity that yourself, if it exists, your inherently existent self, right? Because we're being clear about the two ways of talking about the word self. If it exists, it has to exist in one of those ways, right? And once you come to a clarity about that, and then you move on, then the rest of the meditation will have power. Otherwise, it will be much less powerful because you won't understand the pervasion. That's all. But let's do the dedication. The supreme jewel, bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In this snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara.